The Emily Ocker cast-on is a cast-on that belongs to a group of cast-ons that are sometimes called eyelet. That's how I learned them. I've also learned they're called noose. I've also learned they're called drawstring. But they are cast-ons that are suitable for the center of a circular shawl, or the center of a hat, or the center of any disc of knitting, or even not even a disc, even a sort of shaped top to a beanie. And it just makes a very tight, neat edge. It's also, in my estimation, a very tricky cast-on to do. There are a lot of little details that if you get one wrong, can affect the cast-on. So let's start with the cast-on. We're going to make a loop. Now, some people make a single loop. The tail of the loop should come to the right side. The working yarn should come to the left. I personally like a double loop, but there are some disadvantages to a double loop. You have to be very careful when you set up your double loop that they are a spiral, which is to say, let's do this, 1, 2, 3, and that they're not twisted. So you have to have 3 nicely, neatly stacked up rounds that are not twisted. And I say that because if you have them twisted, they can cause the drawstring not to close up on you. And then what you get is an ugly knotted mess, and you think, oh, I'm never going to do this again. Been there, done that. Okay, so here's our 3 stacked up loops, and now we're going to start to cast on. I'm casting onto a circular needle. You could cast onto a single double pointed needle, and with the Emily Ocker cast on, the first set of cast on stitches, the first 8 stitches, are cast onto 1 needle, and then you can knit 4, move it around, and go into a magic loop, or you can knit 2, 2, 2, 2 onto a set of double pointed needles. So whichever you prefer, this cast on works. I happen to prefer and have handy a circular needle, but this was designed to be used with double pointed needles. So we have our 3 strands of yarn. Now what we're going to do is, actually I made a mistake. We need to have 3 strands of yarn with the tail in front and the stacks in back. See? Now that's only because I've recently changed how I do this, and I knew that you couldn't have them twisted. So here's our 3 stacks of yarn, or 3 circles. Snug up this one. They don't have to be the same size, but it does help, I think. So here are 3 yarns stacked up with the tail in the front to the left and the working yarn in the back pointing, tail in front pointing to the right, working yarn in back pointing to the left. Okay, so what you do is you're going to take your needle and you're going to hold the loops. We're going to take our thumb, put it in the loop, pull out a stitch. We're going to put the needle into the stitch. We're then going to knit the stitch, and I find it, there it goes, and now it's going to be difficult to snug up, but we're going to snug it up. Now what this reminds me of more than anything is the double knotted stitch, because you're doing in effect 2 stitches. So we're picking our stitch up, putting our needle into the front of the stitch, wrapping the yarn around the needle as if it were a stitch, pulling this off so we've in effect knitted it, bringing the stitch fairly close to the other stitch and snugging it up. Now what happens is when we're snugging it up, the needle is controlling the size of the stitch, and we want to snug this fairly tight but leave the needle stitch loose. So this is a cast on that you might actually want to do on a slightly larger needle if you want. So again, our fingers are in the loop. We're going to stick our thumb in, pull out a stitch. put the stitch on the needle. And the reasons for putting our thumb on it is it gets it lined up right. Okay, so there's our stitch. Pull it close to the other stitch and slowly snug it up so it's tight around these threads, but the stitch on the needle is not that tight. Again, thumb into the loop, pull out the stitch, put the needle into the front, and make a stitch, pass it over, pull the stitch close to the others. Now you see we have to pull from here all the way down to here. So it's going to be a little difficult, as I say, to snug up. So I sort of wiggle the yarn back and forth to get the bottom stitch snug, which is important, very important, but the top stitch on the needle should not be that snug. So into the loop, pull out a stitch, needle into the front of the stitch, wrap the yarn as if to make a stitch, pass the stitch over, bring it close to the others, and slowly snug it up. So we have 2, 4, 5. I want to do 8 into the loop. And that first one's really hard, but after that it's not too bad to put your finger into the loop because the loop is stabilized now by the stitches. Pass the stitch over. So we have, bring it close to the others, tighten it up, and as I say, I find sometimes I have to pull on the loop. Now one of the things is I'm pulling on the loop. One of the things you'll notice is, ooh, that tail has gotten small. I usually leave a slightly longer tail. Is you want to be able to pull the tail through. So you want to have these snugged up, and part of snugging them up is going to be the making sure they're wrapped around the center core. Pick up with your thumb, transfer onto the needle, make a stitch, bring it close to the others, hold it with your index finger to secure it, pull the loop, pull the thread, tighten up the stitch. 2, 4, 6, 7, one more. Okay, only because 8 is a fairly common number. It's not the only number. So the stitch is on the needle, and things are pretty stable now with this loop, so I can be, I don't have to worry about it. It's after the, I would say after the second stitch, the loop is pretty stable. Now we have 8. Now what I usually recommend doing is working almost what I would call I-cord style, which is to say, slide these stitches to the other end of your double pointed needle and start working the first round. And the first round, very, very frequently in an increase like this, is knit 1, make 1, knit 1, make 1. I'm not going to demonstrate that, but I very often do that first round before I do this next step. And this next step is closing the loop. So we're going to get our tail, oops, there we go, our tail, and we're going to hold the base of the stitches. Now, this is worsted weight yarn, but I can still manage to pinch in between my index finger, and we're going to pull this yarn to the right, and we're going to begin to close up one of the 2 loops. Nope, there we go, there. And before we pull, I'm going to just pull this to the back. Okay, now there's a slight twist. This is a slight twist that you have to be careful of, and I got one anyway, but it does happen. So now I'm going to take the right side of the smaller loop, and I'm going to pull on that. There we go. We're going to pull on the small loop yarn, getting it close here, pinching these slightly. I had the wrong yarn. Pinching these slightly, and I'm going to pull and pull and pull, and this second loop slowly but surely tightens up, and I'm going to continue. I'm going to pull till it's fairly snug. So now I have a single loop. Now I'm going to take the tail, and if you only had one loop, you'd be done by now. I'm now going to take the tail, and again, pinching these stitches, which are easier to do because they're tighter and closer together. I'm going to pinch and pull, and now you can very clearly see the eyelet. The stitches at this point are not distributed evenly around the eyelet. That's because we haven't knit a row. We haven't started really working in the round. So I'm going to just do one magic loop type row. Pull the stitches to here. Make sure we use not the tail. This is the tail. Make sure, as I say, we work I-cord style. So take the yarn from the back, and we're going to then knit slowly. There we go. First stitch. Oops. The first stitch, I-cord style. Knit one. Slide the stitch off. Nah, just one. And make a yarn over and knit two. And make a yarn over and knit three. And make our yarn over. Now, as I say, after the first two, if you're using double pointed needles, you could switch right onto 2, 4 into double pointed, then 2, 4 into the second needle. So we have 2, 4, one more. So this is the fourth stitch. Oops. And off, and the fourth yarn over. And at this point, if I were working magic loop, I would pull these stitches over so that I have my little loop, and make sure I continued with the working yarn. Okay, and do the same thing on the second side. Though, as I say, after 2 stitches, excuse me, you could just do them on double pointed. So you could do the same process, sliding the stitch off, making a yarn over, knitting the next stitch, and making a yarn over, and knitting a stitch, making a yarn over, knitting a stitch, making a yarn over. And I'm going to move this now to the center of my cord on my cable needle. I'm going to move it right to the fold so I can pull it round. And what you can see now is, it's all tangled up below. What you can see now is very clearly you have this little round eyelet of stitches. A very tight little star there in the center, and it will not loosen because of the double loop of yarn. This star will stay tight, so you can just weave in your end. And obviously doing this with the camera, holding it and demonstrating it, I see I split one of my stitches. But the tricks are in how you position your yarns for making the loop, and the process of picking up a stitch and then knitting the stitch and doing that seamlessly. It is difficult and tricky, but once you have mastered it, and it takes, as I say, 2 or 3 times, your tail gets very long. We started out with I could barely see the tail. Now we have a nice long tail, but I usually wrap it up into a butterfly to make sure I don't work with it. And after a few rounds, I pull it forward sometimes so that I have my tail stitch pulled forward, and then I weave it in and out of rows of knitting to keep track of the beginning of the round. So that's another option. So there is the Emily Ocker cast on. I hope you try this soon. Bye bye.